Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Moore, and I work at WashU as the head of data services. I'm also program faculty in international and area studies and an instructor of GIS. The data services team at WashU support faculty, students, staff, and affiliated researchers in data analysis, curation, literacy management, visualization, and GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. On behalf of the WashU Alumni Association, I'm excited to welcome you to Why Data Matters Now More Than Ever with WashU alumnus Randy Bean. Before we begin, I'd like to explain the format of today's session. You will only hear and see myself and Randy. The webinar will last an hour. Following the featured presentation, we'll have time for questions, and we encourage you to participate by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Thank you to those of you who have submitted questions with your registration. During the Q&A session, we will try to get to as many questions as possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Alumni Association YouTube channel following the event. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Randy Bean. Randy is a 1978 graduate of Washington University in St. Louis and currently sits on the National Council for the College of Arts and Sciences. He's also co-chair of the James Merrill House, an internationally recognized Writers in Residence program based in Stonington, Connecticut. An industry thought leader, author, and speaker in the field of data-driven business leadership, Randy Bean is known for his frequent columns in Forbes, Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of Fail Fast to Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data, and Artificial Intelligence, or AI, and CEO of New Vantage Partners, a strategic advisory firm he founded in 2001. Please welcome me in joining Randy Bean.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for the kind introduction and mention of the book. I'm just going to mention two Washington University anecdotes, one in passing and one which is germane to this discussion. First of all, Jennifer mentioned that I sit as co-chair of the James Merrill House, an internationally recognized Writers in Residence program. And as it so happens, James Merrill's papers are stored in the special collections at Washington University in St. Louis. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit special collections, I encourage you to take a look at James Merrill's papers. One other anecdote, which is relevant to this discussion today and is actually alluded to in the final chapter of the book. And that was in early 2011. I happened to be thumbing through the Washington University Alumni magazine, and I saw that a former housemate of mine, Zachary Lemnios, who graduated in 1979 with a master's in electrical engineering, had recently been appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, a position he held from 2009 through 2012. And lo and behold, in reading this little blurb in the Alumni magazine, it mentioned that one of his mandates was to develop a policy for the Defense Department and federal government around big data, which was, of course, my area of focus and interest. So I wound up reaching out to Zach, and he responded and he said, "We'd love to have you come to the Pentagon." And I said, "Sure, why not?" And he said, "Well, can you come next week?" I said, "Yes, I suppose I can." I'd only been to the Pentagon as a visitor, but what happened was I flew down there. I went through all of the levels of security. Basically, they confiscated just about everything I had. And I walked into a room of about 18 people. 6 of them had on full military regalia, stars and bars, generals, ranks of that kind. Another half dozen were in camouflage fatigues, and another half dozen were on full business suits. And I turned to Zach and I said, "Who are the decision makers here?" I really couldn't tell because it was different than the typical meeting I'd go into on Wall Street or at organizations like American Express. And they began talking about the challenges they faced in capturing data and then analyzing data so they could make decisions about what they termed campaigns. Now, I was used to going to banks and retailers. When they talked about campaigns, they were talking about marketing to individuals so they could attract more customers and retain those customers and treat their customers more effectively. And what I quickly came to realize was that here at the Pentagon, they were talking about military campaigns and specifically about drone strikes and being able to capture quality data and analyze that data so they could make effective decisions about whether to launch a drone strike or not. So it was certainly a magnitude of impact relative to the audiences that I usually spoke to about their uses of data. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and move to the presentation for today. Let's see if this works. Okay. So as mentioned, Randy Bean, and the presentation today is on why data matters now more than ever. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit about both the topic and the process. So I'm going to begin by reading from the very first sentence, essentially, of the book, because this really frames the argument or the thesis of the book. The world is in a race to become data-driven, now more than ever. The warp speed effort to organize scientific and epidemiological data from across the globe in a heroic effort to find a COVID-19 vaccine has illustrated the urgency and existential nature of this quest. We need data, science, facts, knowledge, and insight to make informed, wise, and critical decisions. Now more than ever, data matters, and having good data matters tremendously. So that's really the central premise of this book, that we live in an age where we're inundated with data. The COVID-19 situation over the past year, average person started looking at positivity rates, trying to look at the data to analyze what it meant for them. So it's gone from a backroom activity that data scientists were focusing on to something that everybody cares about and should matter to everyone. And that's part of the point of this slide, the relevance of data. It's touching all walks of life. It's impacting our daily lives. I have on the screen here a COVID-19 dashboard, several other, so there's a political campaign, data analysis. And then there's Brad Pitt and Moneyball. So one of the things that happened about a decade ago was that, or more, the book was written, Moneyball, by Michael Lewis, and it talked about the use of data and how it was changing decision-making in professional sports. So it really elevated the whole discussion of data, and this time in the context of sports. Often people would ask me what I did, people that were laymen, so to speak, and the way that I tried to explain it, to simplify it for them, was I said, I do Moneyball for business. And lo and behold, it went from the point where, as I mentioned, it was data scientists working in the back room to Brad Pitt now being the epitome of the data analyst or the data decision maker. So became a glamorized profession of sorts. So data is in the news these days, and not always for good. I don't know how many of you happened to hear the Facebook hearings before Congress a few weeks ago, and also the testimony of the Facebook whistleblowers. So I'm going to share with you some quotes over the past few years. These appear in the book. One is, the amount of data in our world has been exploding. Leaders in every sector will have to grapple with the implications of big data. A second, we had all of the data, we just didn't connect the dots. Well, you should know that that quote actually came from the 9/11 Commission report. So, that's pretty profound and poignant. They had the data, but they weren't able to piece it together to tell in advance what was about to happen. We will make our decisions guided by expertise, data, and science. This quote was actually from former Governor Andrew Cuomo at the beginning of the COVID epidemic. Apparently, he didn't fully follow all of his guidance. Another quote, big data will create winners and losers, and it is likely to benefit the institutions who will wield its tools over the individuals being mined, analyzed, and sorted. Well, that sounds a lot like the Facebook situation. Another one, in the future, will big data help physicians cure diseases or help health insurance deny claims, make factories and products safer or accelerate layoffs, ultimately spawn some kind of hostile artificial intelligence? I love this last quote here, and this is actually from somebody I knew socially who was actually a jazz musician in his 90s. And he said to me, so if there is all of this new data, how come it doesn't look like anyone is getting smarter? So very simple observation, but profound in many ways. So why this book now? Well, when I embarked on writing it, which was just about a year ago at this time, it was right around the Thanksgiving holidays. It was the second COVID-19 winter. I was anticipating a long, dark, and cold winter here in the Northeast in Boston, where I couldn't really travel anywhere. Though I studied literature and history at Washington University, I really wasn't able to write the next Moby Dick or Great Gatsby, and they say, write about what you know. And I've really had a front seat to the information revolution over the 35 to 40 years of my career. I've worked as a management consultant, I've worked in the financial services industry, and worked in Silicon Valley. And I started writing about the topic of big data, starting in the Wall Street Journal in 2014, 2015. I had a monthly column for 2 years, and have carried that on at Forbes, and I contribute regularly to Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Review on this topic. 3 articles this year in Harvard Business Review, and every other month series in MIT Sloan Review on data, artificial intelligence, and some of the themes in this area. So the timing was right, now more than ever, and there was a sense of urgency. So what was I trying to accomplish in writing this book? One was I wanted to impart, my experience over the last generation and write a history of the information age, or the age of big data. I also want to make the book accessible to general readers who are trying to understand what is all the fuss about. I wanted to make it entertaining and informative. I wanted to make it provocative, and for many, a manifesto for action to think about and to act on some of these principles. And I really wanted to tell a story with anecdotes and examples, and for the experts, include case studies so that they could go deep. And primarily, it was also for business leaders who often don't really care about the technology. They want to understand what is the business value and how do they make decisions? How do we do it right? How do we avoid the pitfalls? So who was the intended audience for this book? As mentioned in part, there were really 4 different audiences that I was aiming to address with the book. One was CEOs or board members, so senior executives, decision makers, people that rely on data. And this can be not only CEOs within private industry, but also decision makers within government and the public sectors. So these are people that care about the value. What does the data tell us? What does it mean? But not so much about, how we get it or what are the technologies behind it. At the same time, I want to speak to industry professionals. These are practitioners, data professionals, data analysts, data scientists, data engineers, those who are working with data on a day-to-day basis and want to understand what other organizations are doing and what's working and what's not working. Third category I want to speak with was educators and students, those in universities, those in executive education programs. What can be learned? What is the opportunity for data professionals? How can universities develop a modern data curriculum? And then finally, as mentioned, general readers, laymen, help educate and understand the general public, help to educate the general public, and then help them understand what is all the fuss about and why data and why this topic matters to them. So how did I decide on the title? Well, that goes a little bit back to my studying English literature. And as I recalled, the great Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, who wrote Waiting for Godot, he had a famous saying from one of his books, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. So that's really a metaphor for learning through action. how individuals and organizations, how they learn through experience, and experience entails trial and errors. And that's one of the ways that organizations innovate. Paul Saffo, the futurist, has stated failure is the foundation of innovation. John Bottega, one of the chief data officers for major banks responsible for their data initiatives, has said data is informative. Even with imperfect data, business analysts can gain insight and knowledge. The Facebook mantra has been move fast and break things. Somebody recently said it should be move fast and learn how to fix things. And Voltaire said, perfect is the enemy of good, with the point here being that we can't wait to initiate actions and to attempt initiative based on data. We can't be facing a situation of analysis paralysis. We need to try things and see what works. In the data science world, many organizations practice what is test and learn, and that is basically changing the variables to see what yields the most favorable or the most predictive results. So the idea here is really the same, and that is trying different things, see what works, learn from that experience, correct, and move forward. How did I tell the story? I developed the central themes of the book, which I'll speak about shortly, the key ideas. I used real world examples, many drawn from my writings over the years, major institutions across many industries, firms like Allstate, Charles Schwab, Anheuser-Busch, a company that originated in St. Louis, Amazon, MasterCard, JP Morgan, Chase, Bloomberg, Capital One, among others, as well as the Department of Defense that I referenced earlier. So these are great brands with great stories that others could learn from. Just an aside, I want to mention that when I went through the process of publishing a book, you get involved in a series of activities that you might not otherwise expect. And one of them was designing the book cover. And fortunately, through my involvement with the James Merrill House, Chip Kidd happens to sit on our advisory board, and Chip Kidd is most noted. He's considered to be the rock star of book designers. And most notably, he designed the cover for Jurassic Park with that famous image. So when the publisher produced these 5 sample book titles, I sent a note to Chip Kidd and said, which one would you select? And he selected the one with the red and black motif and the little bit edgy fail fast, learn faster. So it's the book publisher, Wiley & Company, said actually it was the first time that one of their authors brought somebody like Chip Kidd to the table to choose the book cover. So, I guess you avail yourself of what's available to you. So fail fast, learn faster, lessons in data-driven leadership in an age of disruption, big data, and AI. It's a perspective on where we've been and where we are going. The foreword is written by my colleague and friend, Professor Thomas Davenport, who has written roughly 18 books in the field of data and artificial intelligence, including the classic business bestseller, Competing on Analytics, which was written about 20 years ago. So there's 10 major themes I address in the book. The first is I start with what I call a little history of big data, which is a bit of a play on words. And that was basically a summation of what's happened over the past 35 or so years. And it's interesting because the same issues that organizations were trying to address at the start of my career are really many of the same issues that organizations are trying to address today. What can our data teach us? How can we gain insights? How can we learn? How can we use our data to inform our decision-making processes? But what's happened is data has proliferated exponentially over those 35 to 40 years. At the same time, computer power has grown massively. So now, for example, where a company like American Express had to look at a sample data set to make a credit decision, now they can look at all of the data that exists that's available to them for any individual or all of their customers to make the credit decision. They can do that in basically a split second. So that's what I try to do in terms of the initial chapter, paint a history of where we've been and where we are today. The second chapter is called Think Different. It's about developing a different mindset, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on these specific chapters as we move forward. The third chapter is on data science and facts, and I try to talk about the importance of data science and facts in making informed decisions, particularly in a world today where data science and facts have been called into question, and I'll elaborate a little bit on this point. I then talk about the state of data in the corporate world today. There's an annual survey that my firm conducts each year, and of Fortune 1000 companies, and some of the data and the data from the survey is interesting. For example, only 48.5% of Fortune 1000 companies report that they're driving innovation with data, so less than half. Only 41.2% report that they're competing on data and analytics, so roughly only two-fifths. Only 39.3% say that they are managing data as a business asset, so over 60% say they don't. 24.4% say they forged a data culture, so that means nearly over three quarters have not. And only 24% say that they've created a data-driven organization, so over three quarters say they have not. And this is pretty remarkable considering that we've been at this for 35 to 40 years. So again, this is where I try to bring some perspective that this is not a problem solved overnight or easily. And one of the things I talk about in length, which is really the centerpiece of the book, is the great challenge. And those are the cultural issues that are barriers to organizations becoming data-driven, because these imply changes to behavior. When you're a legacy organization that was founded perhaps even over a century ago, changing how you operate, changing your processes doesn't happen overnight. Data as an asset that flows through organizations, so it's a challenge for organizations to manage it and to structure themselves in a way that they can optimize the use of data. The sixth chapter is about the rise of the chief data officer. It's a role that didn't really exist a decade ago. In the survey that we conduct in 2012, 12% of Fortune 1000 companies had named a chief data officer. By this year's survey, it was roughly 2/3 of organizations. So it's really become an accepted and adopted position, but many companies face challenges in terms of making that role successful. Tom Davenport and I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review in August where we spoke about the average tenure for a chief data officer being only 2.5 years. So considerable turnover in the position. And some of the major banks are actually on their 5th, 6th, and even truthfully, their 7th iteration of the chief data officer in the past decade. Chapter 7 is actually my favorite chapter of the book. It's called Data Responsibility, a word on data ethics. And that's where I talk about all of the dangers that are posed by data, apart from the good things about data, such as scientific advancement. Data, if misused by a totalitarian regime, or somebody would say Facebook, can have potentially very harmful consequences. Chapter 8 is about data disruption innovation, how data can be used to disrupt and dramatically change industries. If you look at the largest market capitalization firms in the world today, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles, I see Tesla entered that list yesterday. So many of these companies are essentially data-driven businesses. And then the last chapter is one company's odyssey. In this case, it's American Express and the challenges and the progress they've made over a decade in terms of their efforts to continue to be a data-driven organization and to continue to learn along the way. So I mentioned previously a little bit about Moneyball. We live in a time when data is in its ascendancy. It wasn't always this way. Before there was a Google, before terms like big data came into vogue, and before jobs like data scientist and chief data officer became sought after positions, data and analytics were considered a niche area relegated to back office practitioners in market research, statistical analysis, and actuarial groups. So a long way from the back office to the Brad Pitt star turn. I spoke about the change in mindset that's required, and there's this quote from the Apple Think Different marketing campaign of 1997, which I love and really summarizes the challenges that organizations face in thinking differently. So the quote goes, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs and the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." And as you can see here, here's some visuals of people that did change the world in various ways: Albert Einstein, Malcolm X, Bob Dylan, and Steve Jobs himself. I mentioned that my favorite chapter was the chapter on data ethics. And the point here is that we have a responsibility. All of us have a responsibility. And this is a quote from the Wall Street Journal in 2018. And I just had to smile or maybe groan when I turned on the news about 2 weeks ago during the Facebook hearings, because this applies aptly. The quote goes, "Big data is the big bad of our moment. Companies and governments amass enormous troves of information about our online and offline activities so they can understand them better than we do. Creepy firms like Cambridge Analytica mine big data from websites such as Facebook. Facebook itself seems increasingly creepy, grounded in lying to the public about what happens to the data it collects." A few years ago, a woman named Kathy O'Neill wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. She talked about algorithmic bias. It's a scathing book. It was nominated for the National Book Award. There's also a picture here, not to take any political position whatsoever, but it's Kellyanne Conway from the Trump administration who said, well, there's facts and then there's alternate facts. So again, that illustrates that data can be cherry-picked. It can be presented very subjectively. The same data can be presented and with a very different story behind it and conclusions drawn from it. I should mention that this chapter in the book draws heavily from the work of Neil Richards from Washington University School of Law, who's done extensive work around data privacy and data ethics. And Professor Richards really opened my eyes for the first time to a lot of the issues around data privacy and data challenges. Finally, just as I move to closing, data is a journey. Becoming data-driven is a journey. It's not a destination. You're never done. Often I walk into organizations, and the organizations that are most successful are the ones that are always striving for continuous improvement. They never feel they're done. They're always looking over their shoulder. They're always wondering how they can be better. And those organizations where I walk into and they say, oh, we've got it all figured out, when I hear that, I really worry about those organizations. So just a couple of quotes here. Fortune 1000 companies are rapidly coming to the realization that to compete in the 21st century, they must adapt to a new order where data-driven competitors with highly agile, data-savvy business cultures are seizing the business initiative. And then finally, a quote from Doug Cutting from Apple Computer, who states, organizations and individuals are on a data journey. It is a slow revolution, a revolution over time. Let iterative success grow and then spread. It is ultimately a process, but perfection is unachievable. It will always be a continuous journey. If you're interested in reading more in the topic, as mentioned, I write extensively in Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and MIT Sloan Review. Here's some recent articles within the past year on the challenges that organizations face in becoming data-driven, the challenges that organizations face in terms of making the chief data officer role successful, some case studies from a number of organizations that have data initiatives underway: Cigna, American Express, MasterCard, TD Bank, among others that I discuss here. Here's some of the blurbs from early praise from the book from some of the reviewers who read it in advance. Dave Edelman, Chief Marketing Officer at McKinsey and former lead of McKinsey's digital marketing practice, he called the book both inspiring and terrifying. The terrifying part is the issues around privacy and data ethics and some of the challenges that we face and need to confront there, and said it was important to read this book across C-suites and boards. Jeffrey Moore was noted for his classic book, Crossing the Chasm. He provided an anecdote, as well as Don Peppers and Martha Rogers, who wrote the classic One-to-One Future and really formulated this notion of one-to-one marketing. And Cameron Kerry from the Brookings Institution, and also the brother of 2004 presidential nominee John Kerry, writes, lively explores how data has become an essential element of business strategy in the 21st century. And in closing, Fail Fast, Learn Faster, it aspires to be the newest entry into the literary pantheon, as a literature major. Moby Dick, and the Communist Manifesto, and War and Peace, and The Great Gatsby, and hopefully maybe someday Fail Fast, Learn Faster. I tried to provide a lot of literary quotes so that the book could be appealing not only to technologists, but to general readers from the liberal arts and from all study areas, and hope you'll find it interesting. And it's available for order on Amazon. So at this point, I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Randy. Let's get right into the questions from our registrants. The first one is, data matters more than ever, but we need a population that is science and math literate to match it. Right now, many of the elective representatives are not even science and math literate. How can we as a country keep making positive changes without these fundamentals? We fell behind the world in science and math decades ago, and we still are. How can we address this for the benefit of the entire nation?
Well, that's interesting, because I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian perspective. So as I believe was mentioned in the introduction, I sit on the National Council for the Colleges of Arts and Sciences. So I'm a proponent of a liberal arts education. And I think so I'm going to say two things. One, and this maybe answers one of the upcoming questions as well. So the data profession is a great place to be now, and will be not only in the coming years, but I believe in the coming decades and for the next generation. As I mentioned, the volumes of data are proliferating exponentially, and that includes not only structured data, which is basically numbers, but unstructured data, which includes signals and pictures and text and images. I was speaking to one CEO recently who stated to me that 80% of data these days is unstructured data. So organizations are challenged enough just managing their numeric and structured data, let alone beginning to tackle unstructured data. So I'm a huge proponent of the data science profession, and believe that there'll be an abundance of jobs that will be one of the most in-demand skill sets over the coming decades. At the same time, the importance of a liberal arts education and a critical perspective is also essential here. I recently hosted an event that I moderated and interviewed a fellow named Jonathan Kaplan, he's written a recent book called The Magic Years. And he's noted for several reasons. Most recently, he's been serving on the Annenberg School as one of their fellows and professors. But before that, he was and he was also started up a number of companies in the internet area around streaming video and things of that kind, video on demand. But before that, he was a movie producer and a music producer. He was Bob Dylan's tour manager. He organized the concert for Bangladesh, working with George Harrison. He lived with the band in Woodstock and Bob Dylan in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He produced Martin Scorsese's first movie, Mean Streets, and also produced The Last Waltz, which was the movie that featured the band and their farewell performance. And he's taken a pretty sharp perspective. And what he did was, in the interview, he actually scolded the audience and said, what we need is more liberal arts and critical thinkers, because if you left it to Jeff Bezos, he's actually going to create algorithms that put out of work all of the data professionals. So, that's not going to happen overnight, but it does point to the importance of also bringing critical thinking to bear, because programmatic skills, data science skills, they can be turned into algorithms. So huge demand, but also it requires multiple skills.
Okay, I think this kind of leads well. I feel like you've answered our next question, which is, what's your view on choosing data science as a major versus minor? Maybe you can say a little bit about one or the other a little more, but there's also a question here that relates from the Q&A, which is, sorry here. What is your best advice for an upcoming grad who wants to go into the user research field, especially given the pandemic and its effect on face-to-face interviewing / opportunities?
Okay, so I'll treat that as two questions. So the to the first question, I think that the data science and computer science area is a great area to be in now. I'd strongly encourage people to be in that field. I think there's going to be an enormous demand. I think that people should be trained in data science and data engineering and data programming skills. But you might actually want to couple that with a traditional arts and science minor or major, such as English or history or classics or even a foreign language or art history, to get that balance of the technical as well as the liberal arts. As mentioned, I have a particular point of view. I spent most of my time at Washington University studying literature and history and art, but then I was trained as a COBOL and assembler programmer. So I came to both understand the technology, but also appreciate the importance of communications. That's one of the things that's most missing. And one of the biggest challenges that face organizations today is often you have technologists or data scientists that speak in the lingo of the data science and technology profession, and the business executives find it very hard to understand. So as a consequence, they get frustrated, they go their own directions, and the more that everyone can speak the same language, speak in common business terms, speak in plain English, in language that everyone can understand, the better. I will say that there's been a huge transformation in the industry from my perspective over the past 2 years to move to remote work. Most of my clients who are Fortune 1000 companies, they're benefiting from this in many respects in terms of productivity, but also in terms, rather than having people just in one geographic location, they can recruit people from around the world. And they used to be people, because I used them in my work, people that say lived on Maui in Hawaii, or they lived in islands in the Caribbean. And they said, we don't want to be in a 9 to 5, 365 day a year type of job, because we want to live where we want to live, and we want to live the lifestyle that we want to live. But now those people are being engaged and being hired by those firms because they can continue to live where they live, but also do the work and bring the expertise that they can. So I think that remote work is going to dramatically transform the professions, particularly the knowledge professions and particularly the data professions.
Okay, the next question would like for you to comment on the challenges related to privacy and ethical issues due to the shift to a data-driven world.
Yeah, they're huge. I think it's one of the biggest social issues that we face today, and it kind of cuts across the political spectrum. It kind of cuts across a number of spectrums. In Congress now, there's there's initiatives to look at what are the best ways to potentially regulate the big tech companies who have been largely immune to regulation. A few years ago, I remember that Amazon was looking at potentially acquiring Capital One. Capital One is the most innovative and data-driven firm in financial services, because it was really a series of, or a small group of data and analytics folks that started looking at how those algorithms could be brought to the credit card business to serve underserved markets, so to create more efficiency in credit cards. And then they basically created a credit card company that evolved into a bank. So they're the equivalent of what Amazon did to retailing. That's what Capital One did to financial services. So it was only made sense that Amazon, as they thought about branching out potentially into financial services, might look at acquiring a company like Capital One, until they realized that that would make them subject to all of the regulations that financial services firms are subject to currently, which are vast and significant. So that was not a position that Amazon, and it's not a position that Google or Facebook or Apple, for that matter, want to put themselves in, because they're largely free from regulation that traditional legacy companies and legacy industries, not only financial services, but pharmaceuticals and other industries face. So, you know, that's one cut at that question. But the issues of how organizations use our data is of growing importance. So, for example, you know, I was on a panel a few weeks ago, and this was discussed. So if you're interacting with a bank or financial services firm, they will give you a series of forms, and they'll say, yes, we will make you a loan, but we have permission to use your data in various ways. And so you consider the pros and cons, and you generally sign off on that. Then we had somebody from the Mayo Clinic who said, well, in the healthcare field, what happens are people are in a situation where maybe they're seeking a diagnosis because something doesn't seem quite right. And they're presenting with all these forms that say, you need to execute these forms where we can perform any tests on you. So he described this as basically you're signing away your privacy under duress, okay? Because you want to find out if you're healthy or if you're not healthy. And in order to be able to proceed to the next stage, you have to sign these forms. And these forms also provide certain provisions of how data might be used. And then there's the extreme example of Facebook, for example, and Neil Richards could speak in much more detail about this. But not only is it how your data can be used, but it's also how cookies and other devices, how other tracking mechanisms can be placed basically into your environment to track every keystroke, every move, every place you go. So this notion of privacy or that doesn't really exist anymore. Basically, everybody or companies of that kind know everything about you. You know, when you walk down the street, your visual image is taken scores of times, if not hundreds of times, in video cameras. It's virtually impossible to disappear these days. So all of these are a consequence of the proliferation of data, the proliferation of social media, and all of this is really evolved in a unregulated, unstructured environment. And you know, if you look at the Cambridge Analytica issue and how this information was used in political campaigns, it just points to the potential dangers when data is used in a malicious fashion.
All right. Someone has asked if you could talk about artificial intelligence impact on our work lives in 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is precisely what the impact will be is unknown, but that there will be an impact is certain. I remember in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, the internet appeared. I remember when it was called the information superhighway. And the idea at the time, or the venture capitalists said, oh, the internet is going to change everything about everything that we do, and it's going to happen instantaneously. Well, the reality is it didn't happen instantaneously, but ultimately it did happen. And now the digital channel is the way that many or most of us engage in so many of the activities that we do, whether it's purchasing books, purchasing clothes, buying tickets to events, whatever the case may be. So the digital channel did emerge as the primary channel of customer interaction. And in the same way, AI and the embedding of algorithms will become more and more prevalent in terms of buying decisions and product decisions, next product to buy, whether it's financial products, whether it's clothing products. You know, every time you go on and say you go on Google and you type something in, and then all of a sudden you get all these offers that relate to things that you're interested in. Well, of course, that's because this information is being tracked and the algorithms are organizing it to present things that you're most likely to be interested in and buying. So the convenience aspect is that AI is being used to present things that interest you. The other side of that is this information is all being captured into a repository of everything that you read, the sites that you visit, what you click on. All of this is being recorded. I think it was Neil Richards who talked to me about the Alexa devices of Amazon and how one of the notions was Alexa could be used as an alarm clock and put in your bedroom, but basically Alexa also listens and records everything that it hears as well that's triggered. So you don't have to go far to extrapolate how something like that could be potentially misused or presents an invasion of privacy. So, you know, there's things that are coming fast. I attended a event in Laguna Beach a couple of years ago, sponsored by the Wall Street Journal, where they had various tech leaders come and they spoke about, for example, self-driving cars and self-driving trucks. And the predictions a few years ago was that was going to take place within 3 to 5 years. It's going to take longer, but you know, you just think of truck safety and long haul drivers and the hours and this type of thing. And I expect that AI will be used in things like self-driving, particularly for trucks, sooner rather than later. So, you know, it's going to manifest itself in a variety of different ways and in different industries. But that's one example of, I think, it's going to be coming sooner.
So someone's asking if you could give advice on how the public sector can adopt the best practices from your book.
Yeah, it's really the same principles. I wrote an article in June in Forbes, actually interviewing the chief data officer for the Department of Defense, so the current generation of Pentagon leadership. And it talked about all of the federal government has actually launched an initiative over the past 3 years to establish a chief data officer and establish data strategy and data practices across all branches of government. And this was independent of political administrations that actually started during the Trump administration. So there's a great effort to systematically develop a strategy, understand what the data assets are, understand how data can be best deployed in all aspects of government. And the same should be done in universities, in not-for-profit programs. Organizations like MasterCard have set up their Center for Inclusive Growth, which basically shares commercial data with various neighborhood organizations to fight crime and provide street safety and deliver services more effectively. So there's a lot of ways that data can be used for social good as well. I actually participated at a data for social good conference about 4 years ago and hosted a panel. And I had the dean of the School of Social Work at Washington University, who was one of the panelists.
All right. Now, This person is asking if you believe that business leaders today are equipped to understand the technology they need to gather, manage, and analyze the massive amounts of data to help their business. And if they, or if they even need to do that, can they just outsource it someone else to do it for them?
Well, so let me answer that a couple different ways. You don't want to outsource your data, at least the data that's inherent within your organization about your customers, because that's one of your most distinctive competitive advantages. There's a lot of great technologies now. Organizations don't need to build it themselves. They can pick any number of solutions that are well suited to their needs. From my experience, too many organizations focus too much time on the technology and not enough on the business value. We spend a lot of time counseling organizations to identify what are the key business questions that they need to ask that generate the most critical business value for their organizations, develop what's called business use cases, and use that going backwards to identify what data elements that you need to make your decisions, and then what technology solutions will best deliver the data that you need in a timely and efficient fashion. So technology is critical to the success, but organizations need to be careful not to let the tail wag the dog. They need to start with business value and what are the key questions that need to be answered, and then back into the technology that best enables this. And so business leaders themselves don't have to be technology experts, but they do have to understand what it is that they need to answer, and they need to be sufficiently conversant and work with data leaders and technology leaders to understand what capabilities are available that can assist them in that process.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. I want to pull one out of the Q&A. Can you comment on the difference between big data and deep data?
Well, I've heard of deep learning. So, big data is a generalized term that refers to basically data large and small, structured and unstructured. It's a term that captured the zeitgeist, so to speak. People wrote and spoke about data for years and years, but when big data was first coined around the time of 2010, 11, 12, all of a sudden it captured the imagination, because there was this idea that data was now big and was important, and so it elevated the discussion. It elevated the awareness at the board level and the CEO level. So big data is used more as a metaphorical or general term that captures all categories of data. Deep learning is a very specific analytics technique, somewhere between machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I'm probably not the best person to provide the best technical explanation of deep learning, though what I will say is that in the same way that big data is used broadly to mean many different things, artificial intelligence is used broadly to mean many different things. So for example, it's not uncommon to see large organizations and Fortune 1000 companies speak about artificial intelligence initiatives in their annual reports. But when you dig down deep, the people that are really the technology experts say, this isn't really artificial intelligence. It's advanced analytics or machine learning, which is a combination of human interaction and technology enablement.
All right, so last question. In a nation founded as we the people, by the people, and for the people, how can the people maintain control of our own data and prosper independently?
Yeah, well, let's hope we stay that way. That's one of the challenges, because people willingly share their data in exchange for convenience, but often without a real understanding and real appreciation. There's many initiatives that are happening globally. There's the GDPR initiative that was established, General Data Protection Regulation, that was established in Europe. There's the CCPA, I believe it is, California, or maybe the initials are different, but California has a data privacy initiative. There's a number of initiatives in an exploratory stage in terms of creating GDPR type of equivalents in the US. There's been, a significant amount of resistance because of the notion, that we're free and we're individuals. So it's going to be a complex topic that, buffers against these issues of individual privacy and, what are individual rights and what are the trade-offs.
So we actually have time for one more, and I'm going to pull one more from the chat. They ask, healthcare organizations say about 80% of the work right now is spent cleaning the data. And I know you specifically talk about this in your book. Lots of organizations brag about their data set, but no one seems to have cornered the market. Is the data really the value or the analytics? How does a data owner gain durable advantage?
Yeah, well, that ties back to the opening, because when I was invited to the Pentagon, what they said to me, they said, well, we invited you here because we'd like to learn from the best practices of private industry in the Fortune 1000, because we have a major problem, and that is we're spending 80% of our time cleaning the data, and it only leaves us 20% of our time to analyze the data, and we don't have the time to do that, particularly when we have to execute these campaigns. So what can we learn from private industry? And I laughed and I said, well, it's the same